I'm now pleased to welcome two really extraordinary advocates for diversity and social justice to the Voices stage. Some of you may recognize DeRay Mckesson as one of the most well-known faces of the Black Lives Matter movement and a passionate advocate for social justice and change in America. And June Sarpong is also recognizable to many of us living in the UK as a television broadcaster, and soon the author of a new book called Diversify, which explores inclusion and diversity in the context of growing social divisions. And in this conversation, what we really want to explore is the value of diversity.
Yep.
You know, this morning we heard a lot about growing racial tensions, growing divisions in society, and with societies that are splintering and breaking. It's a difficult context for people, for minorities, especially in the wake of things like Brexit and Donald Trump.
Yep.
One of the speakers this morning pointed out that racist attacks after Brexit skyrocketed 40%. The same thing is happening at the moment in the United States following the Trump victory. So I just want to start by asking kind of a general question to both of you, which is, why does it feel like, after all of the progress we've made over the past decades since the civil rights movement in the United States, why does it feel like we're moving backwards towards a less tolerant society? DeRay, can we start with you?
Yes, so the important thing about this work is that the goal is acceptance, it's not tolerance. The tolerance at best is on the pathway to acceptance. And then what we're finding now when we think about the issue of policing or so many other issues is that these are not new issues, that they've always been under the surface, but that in the age of social media and technology that we're able to talk about these things in public and that people understand that they're not alone in dealing with them, and that that's what's new in this moment, that the issues are not new, but the public conversation about them is new. And I'm hopeful that the public conversation actually pushes us to think about solutions in a new way, but we push really hard against this idea that tolerance is the goal, that acceptance should be the goal, that I shouldn't have to tolerate hate speech and homophobia and xenophobia and Islamophobia, that we should be pushing people to think about how we build an inclusive and accepting world.
So do you think technology has played a role in this kind of feeling that we're becoming less accepting? Or do you think, we're going backwards? Or, what is your sense about the kind of general trend? Because, for some time, I think people would have argued we're making progress. But all of a sudden, it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, I think we've made progress, but I think we still have a lot more to go. And I think when I think about the issue of policing, which in so many ways started the movement, it's like we knew that the police had been killing people for a long time, but the police in America killed 3 people a day. And it wasn't until there were videos and until people were tweeting about it and putting it on Facebook that people were like, wow, this is happening all across the country. It's not just happening in that random city across there. It's happening at my corner store and in my neighborhood too. And that has helped people see that the issue is much closer to them. Which doesn't mean that there hasn't been progress, but it does mean that there's way more progress to be made.
June.
I suppose I'm a sort of an eternal optimist, so I'm a little bit more hopeful. There's a fabulous James Baldwin quote, and I think, DeRay, you'll probably know it better than I do, which goes something like this, that not everything that is acknowledged can be changed, but nothing that isn't acknowledged can be changed. And I think actually what we have to become much more honest about is, my parents came to the UK 40 years ago. When they arrived, there were signs that said, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. I've been able to do things that my mother would never have had the opportunity to do. And I think what we mustn't forget is we have to allow people to feel comfortable to voice their genuine anxieties. And what's happened with the sort of political correctness was we suppressed any kind of sort of discourse or any kind of discomfort with integration and change, and we didn't allow the very people that are impacted, because particularly in this country, it's the white working class that have to deal with immigration. Immigration doesn't really impact the middle classes and the upper classes because their schools are not the schools that are all of a sudden change in terms of ethnic demographic and all of the sort of implications that come with that. And I think what we need is honest dialogue where we talk about the things that we are uncomfortable with, and it's through those conversations that you then get to that sort of magical space where you begin to see the other as part of you. And actually, in terms of the white working class in this country, which is different to America, they have led the way on immigration because they are the ones who integrate the most. They are the ones who work in much more diverse environments than in sort of higher, work in much more diverse working environments than the sort of white-collar jobs, as it were. So I think we just now need to start being honest, and we haven't been honest for a very long time. So everything that you see, which is so troubling, is almost like a big step back to be able to take a seismic step forward. That's my feeling.
You know, our industry, the fashion industry, is one that thrives on diversity and has, in some ways, been very accepting to minorities. Your new book that's coming out next year talks about, diversify, talks about the benefits of diversity, and I just thought that would be a really interesting, if you could just lay out some of the arguments in the book. You've been working with Professor Heath at Oxford University on some really interesting research around the benefits of diversity, because I think apart from this idea of like acceptance or tolerance, there's a really positive story to tell around diversity.
There is. I mean, it's where the magic happens when somebody who has a different viewpoint to you, a different perspective from you, from yours, and that's where you learn, isn't it? That's how you grow. And I think the work that we're doing with the book, with Anthony, his team at Oxford, is we're just looking at the research and we're looking at the data, because for so long, the conversation around diversity has been the moral argument, and we all know morally it's the right thing to do. We know morally we should be much more inclusive, and obviously we'll change the word tolerant, but still it hasn't fully worked. And so what we're looking at also is the financial argument. So we look at the cost of discrimination, and we look at various other groups. And whether that be women, whether that be LGBT, whether that be disability, whether that be discriminated men, and within that group we look at black men, we look at Muslim men, and we look at white working class men. And so the metrics are, what does it cost to discriminate against this group, and how much could they be contributing if we created a framework that enabled them to be the best they can be? And we add those two metrics together, and that is the cost of discrimination. And in a globalized economy, we cannot afford to do this anymore. So really, we know the moral argument, but now we're looking at the financial argument. So and the benefits are huge.
So if everyone is given an environment in which they're able to contribute, society benefits. Totally. So let's lay out the facts a little bit. I know both of you have lots of understanding and experience about inequality in your respective countries that have lessons for us, not just in the UK and the US, but broader than that. What is the current situation in terms of inequality when it comes to race and other minority groups?
So before I start there, I'll just piggyback on this diversity and inclusion issue, is that in a simple way, diversity is about bodies in workplaces and colleges or in different settings, and inclusion is about culture. And what we've seen is a lot of people focus on diversity, so they like increase the number of bodies. You can hire 15,000 more gay people and still have a really homophobic workplace, and that's a focus on diversity and not inclusion. So people have to do both and we've seen people heavily invest in this diversity work without actually doing the work of inclusion, and that isn't doing the work of actually changing the way people experience workplaces. And
how people see themselves as well, which is really important.
Yep.
Some of the stuff we were doing.
Yeah. It's the culture piece. Is that again, you hire gay people, it's still homophobic, still a problem, right? Hire black people, it's still racist, still a problem. And people we have to build that language in the work. In terms of the disparity with the police, the police in America kill 3 people a day. What is really wild about it is if you get killed in America and a newspaper doesn't write about it, then you're not in the data set. You don't exist because the national government doesn't collect information about police killings, which is a real challenge. And we know that they don't. And black people are disproportionately killed by the police. So there's some towns in Texas where it looks like white people are being disproportionately killed by the police, but we think that Latinos are actually just being miscoded as white because all they have to go off is their names, which is wild. And in terms of mass incarceration, we incarcerate more people than anybody else in the world. And it is, you're 6 times more likely as a black person to be in jail. And people focus so much on people in prison, but there are about 7 million people in the criminal justice system in America, and about half of those people are on probation, right? So it's not just a matter of who's in jail, but it is like there's so many people out there in probation. And people don't think about things like private probation, that in America, we make some inmates pay for their own anklets. And if they can't afford their anklet, then they violated their probation and they're back in jail. And you're like, well, that is a wild system that we've just allowed to exist and perpetuate.
And June, what does your research say about inequality and inclusiveness in the UK?
Yeah, well, I think in the UK, in terms of inequality, when you break it down on the various groups, I think an interesting one of the things that I found fascinating is on the most discriminated group, actually, in this country, and I'm sure it's the same in America, I haven't looked at that data yet, is the disabled. It's almost like that is a group that is completely ignored. And when you look at how we could better integrate people with disability, whether that be mental illness through to actual physical impairment into the workforce, we are missing a big trick there. So there's a factory in, this is a fashion industry audience, there's a factory in Scotland, which is a fulfillment centre, and they hire predominantly people with Down syndrome. And what's fascinating about that factory is it's so efficient and so brilliantly run, because part of the sort of being on the spectrum of Down syndrome is you like repetitive behaviour. So for that factory, sort of repacking boxes and so on, their workers love it. So these are ways that we can integrate people who have been forgotten by society into our businesses and better benefit as a result.
So, what else should we be doing? So, like with problems like this that are so deeply rooted in society, in culture, in economic policy and government policy, what should we be doing, both at a kind of government level and at an individual level and at an organizational level to solve these problems?
I think the toughest thing, which we all probably don't want to admit, is that we all have unconscious bias, all of us, like it or not. We all have some level of intolerance or fear of the other within us. And it's really being aware of that and being aware when that is at play, and that is what is judging the way you look at someone else, and the way you hire someone else, and the way you promote someone else. Because that's the other thing with the pipeline, is we have diversity more so at the bottom, but actually getting these people to the top is a whole different ballgame. So individually, let's look at ourselves. And from my own experience, part of the reason I decided to write the book was I was filming in Las Vegas a few years ago, and there was a kid on set who was quite sort of menacing, as it were, and I was really uncomfortable around him. And I'm from a council estate in Walthamstow, so it's not like I'm not used to this, but I wasn't used to it in that context. And in that moment, I thought, as a black woman, my goodness, if I am reacting this way to him, how must he feel in our industry? And it was that made me sort of challenge myself and think, my God, this is what discrimination is. Because when you're a person of color, you only think of being on the receiving end as opposed to being a perpetrator, as it were. So I think it's being honest with ourselves. And then obviously within that, once you start hiring and promoting all people and enabling everyone to be their best, you'll see the benefits. And I think that then trickles on to a government level.
I think that we have to, 2 things. One is we have to start talking about race in public more. That one of the things that we've not benefited from is having these like siloed and secret conversations about race and the role of whiteness. That one of the things that whiteness has done, and what makes it so insidious, is that whiteness has become normal, right? Like whiteness is the standard for what normal means. And as Baldwin said, that whiteness becomes a metaphor for power. And in this work, we just don't talk about that enough, that people feel threatened. And I've talked to a lot of people who are like, DeRay, white privilege isn't real. They're like, I worked really hard. They're like, I did all this stuff. And it's like, well, how hard did you work to make sure that every Band-Aid looks like you? Or how hard did you work to make sure that nude is the color of your skin and not the color of mine? Like, how hard did you work to make sure that baby dolls look like you? Like, you didn't do that. That wasn't your individual work. Like, that is what happens when whiteness becomes normal. And that part of what we have to do in this industry and in all industries is uproot that, to talk about, like, normal is everybody. Like, everybody is what normal is. And that's a beautiful thing. So that's like one part of the work. And the second part of the work is don't do what Facebook did. You know, Facebook is so funny in the election in America. If you've not read any of the news about the fake news and how much it traveled on Facebook, you know, Facebook's really funny because they go out and they say they're like, we change the world every day. We impact the world. But they're like, we had nothing to do with the election. And you're like, okay. And what you know to be true is that the fashion industry, what you talk about, what you look at, what you, who you talk to, like the world looks at, the world talks about, the world talks to. And what does it look like for you to use your platform in ways that talk about this work authentically? It's not enough for you to just like slap 10 more black people on the covers of your magazines or like put them in ads. It's like, what are the stories on the front pages too, right? Like, who are you inviting in the room? And there's so many people in this room that like, you might have never been to a runway show of a black designer that's not Kanye West, right? And like, what does that look like? Like, what is the message that's sending to people? Like, that communicates like a real thing about worth and value that doesn't take like a gazillion dollars from you, but it does mean like you have to think about your access and your resources differently. And in that same vein, it is about your convening power, that like people will come to dinners with you. They will do those things. And are you reaching out to like people who don't have $500,000 to put together a lookbook and a runway show, right? Like, who's doing that work on your behalf? And I've seen so many people opt out and say like, oh, I put a black person on the cover. And you're like, like that actually isn't what the work is. Like, the work is about sort of deconstructing this idea of white as the only normal thing and propping up a deeper and more complex conception of normal.
Could I just add to that
Sure.
quickly? And I think, especially in the fashion business, I think this is a business that really sort of thrives from export. And actually, when you look at the markets that are growing, you know, whether it be the BRIC countries or even now, you know, 6 out of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. There is a new normal. And actually, if fashion is going to thrive and survive, it has to adopt and adapt to that. So actually, diversity is good for business. This isn't about what's sort of PC or the right thing to do. It's good for your bottom line. Simple.
You know, you both naturally transitioned onto my next point, which was to just, you know, I think those of us who work in fashion, we kind of get used to the way things work in fashion. But I'm curious, and I would really love your brutally honest feedback on this. As people who work outside the fashion business, how do you perceive the image that's projected by our industry? You know, when you see the image, and now fashion imagery is everywhere now. It's not just the cover of a magazine. It's Instagram. It's, you know, it's social media. It's Facebook. It's everywhere. You know, fashion imagery is ubiquitous. What do you think about the image that, as an industry, a very powerful, visible industry, we are projecting?
Well, I think it's this image that's kind of been the same for a long time, isn't it, really, in terms of the ideals and what is seen as aspirational? I think you guys need to shake it up a bit, you know, spice it up a bit. How about that? So I think really it's about thinking outside of the fashion box. And I mean, and don't get me wrong, the fashion box is a very glamorous, fabulous box. Hey, I mean, look at this room. But it is about shaking it up and spicing it up a bit. And actually, you know, a lot of the way people think in terms of what's considered beautiful or ideal or covetable is actually started in the fashion industry. And I think you're in a really amazing position to be able to reframe what that is.
So if I'll get to you in a minute, DeRay. June, if you were like running a fashion business or running a fashion media company and you had the ability to do something like tomorrow, what would be your like first recommendation?
My first recommendation would be I would find the most fabulous 95-year-old woman and say, this is the ideal. How about that? You know, no more 18-year-olds. And then I think my second recommendation would be the thing that the fashion industry can actually teach
The rest of the business outside of this industry is about inclusion in terms of on LGBT, because I think you're such a leader on this. You know, we were looking at the construction industry, so I'd like actually the fashion industry to teach the construction industry on how to be much more inclusive in terms of LGBT issues. But really, I think the standard of beauty needs to change.
Okay. DeRay?
You know, as somebody who, I wear the same Patagonia vest every day, you know, I'm not very, you guys, everybody looks great. I'm like, look at those people. I think the looks have changed more than the message. So I think that there seem to be more people of color, like more, like different looks, I think, happening. Not age and size, you're right. I've not seen the message change as much. Like I've seen the same stories sort of written in the same publications about the same things. I think that Teen Vogue is like an outlier in that. Like Teen Vogue, at least in America, has done some really incredible reporting around race and justice in ways that like nobody ever thought Teen Vogue would write about these issues. Like that's been really powerful. You know, I think Dove's, again, the Dove campaign, like I don't even remember what it was called. Real Beauty was good, and then Lane Bryant's campaign that had Gabby Sidibe in it, like, was one that I like remember. Like I remember on social media, everybody was talking about that one. I remember talking about that. In terms of what I would do if I had a different level of access in this community, and I talked to you about this, Imran, is that when I last met with Anna Wintour, one of the pushes to her was like, how do people get to Vogue who like don't have runway shows, right? Like, what does that look like? And the ask was like, will you do a dinner with like emerging designers? And she was like, yeah, right? And like, there are so many people in this room who could also do that. Like, what would it look like to create different pathways to get to you? Because, you know, some of this is like who you sit next to at dinners like this, right? That like, and there's so many people who never get in rooms like these, who never get at tables, like who nobody visits their show, which doesn't mean that they're not a great designer, a great person in the space. And I use Chance the Rapper, if you know Chance the Rapper, who's an awesome rapper. Sheila Rashid is this designer who designs his overalls, and like, you know, the picture went viral. The overalls are great, and I randomly tweeted one day like, who designed his overalls, and like she responded, right? So we had dinner. She's great, and she is not on any track to get to meet any of you, right? But she's an amazing designer who does these, and like, who is looking for those people? Like, who's creating pathways for those people? I want to do that work.
Okay. Thanks, guys. It's a real pleasure to have your perspective.